This is about inside and outside careers within executive management. It's work in progress. We're seeking to look at a couple of questions. There's compensation, promotion, and turnover, difference between women and other groups. Treat those as outsiders. How would regulations affect this? And how would individuals adjust to these kinds of changes? The data is public. It comes from executive comp, basically. Firms have to report to the SEC on their top executives as to all the different components of their compensation and also what that hold in terms of the financial security of the firm that they're in. And this allows us to construct not only the compensation, because we can follow their ranks or follow their positions throughout their tenure within executive management, get a sense of how people progress. And so we estimate a dynamic model in which there is moral hazard, not just moral hazard, but kind of inside information too, because in our framework, when people don't work, well, they don't accumulate human capital in the same way as when they follow what the shareholders want them to do. And that is the main difference between what I presented earlier in the week, way back then, versus now. Not just moral hazard, but human capital ultimately also not being observed by shareholders. So the model rationalizes, seeks to rationalize inside and outside behavior. I haven't told you what inside is yet. I've described outsiders. And I haven't done this, but that's what we're working on, predicting policy innovations to governance. So I've given you a little bit of a description about the data. We construct a set of ranks that people go through that are based, because there are about 150 titles, something like that. And so people start out somewhere, might be sort of a relatively low operation officer, but enough to have to report to the SEC. And they kind of move through different positions. And so you can construct a kind of preference relation to get rid of cycles so that things are both reflexive and transitive as you move up and ultimately out. And from that, you can construct, we've done this in earlier work, a set of rankings that take you from lower level ranked executives right through to CEO and ultimately chairman, and then right out to not SEC, not interested in you anymore, and death, the ultimate promotion. And this ranking should be independent, of course, of what wages are, because it's a kind of the way the compensation already measures one aspect of what's going on in an executive. This is measuring some kind of life cycle progression. We flag individuals when they're on the board of directors, count them as insiders. We also flag them when, for example, I wish, on another firm's board, and on that board or in that firm is someone who sits on my financial compensation committee. See, that kind of connection. or the other way around. And we call those people insiders as well. The reason we call females outsiders is at the moment, or at least when we looked at this data set, and we're expanding it right now, because this is a little out of date, the numbers I'll show you. They're a very small percentage of people that, very small percentage of these kinds of executives are females, 5% or so. Finally, we also categorize firms themselves as to whether they have a large or a small, in terms of insiders, so we could call them entrenched, if they have more than the median number of people who are what we define as insiders. So this gives you some sense of how people transit through the ranks. And you can see the blue to the 5, and then they sort of move across. The out is the light blue. And transition, people don't last very long in these firms, about 5 years at that kind of level. So if they're already at rank 1, well, there's a good chance they'll be at rank 1 next year. But if they're not at rank 1, chances are they'll be out. Okay, so that gives you some idea of why the top one, if they're at rank 5, well, that's the blue, well, then there's a good chance they'll be at 5 or 4 next period. That's the very top bar. You can see how that they tend to stay in the same position. And the next most likely one, except for rank 5, is blue, meaning out. So most people don't go beyond the rank that they come in at. And if you compare men versus women, well, you'll notice that there are more, look at the 2 top bars, you can see that there are more women in rank 5 than men, looking between right and left for the dark blue. And then if you look down the sides there, there's more light blue stuff for the women than the men. And so you can see that they tend to come in at lower ranks and tend to more likely to leave. Those are 2 basic things that come straight out of looking at the marginals on this data. Return briefly to compensation. There are 5 components, or several components, and the main one that I want to flag here is the change, is the change in wealth that's due to executives holding stocks and options in the firm's securities. The change being measured being the difference between the firm return and the stock market return, to reflect the fact that if these people had no connections with the firm at all, then there would be no reason for them to specialize or to have more than trivial amount within the firm's security. They'd hold, say, stocks and bonds more generally. This is a little bit hard to see, but one of the things that I want you to notice is that middle bracket where it says negative compensation, and it basically shows the percentage of people that get negative compensation when you compute compensation this way. This is a reflection of their change in wealth before consumption, and that is why we would argue that, and actually quite a few others argue that this is how to measure compensation for executives. The media still doesn't get it right, but you can see that quite substantial. The percentage changes, but it's about 0.2, sometimes up to 0.3, I guess. And that gives you some sense of what compensation looks like. Female executives, the other thing to notice is the very bottom there. You can see, for example, rank 1, number of observations, females only 119, males 6,500. That gives you some sense of the huge imbalance there is in public corporations and gender representation. It's changed somewhat, but it's gradual. So we also have data on time-varying characteristics, including how old they are, educational background, number of firms that they've worked with. And you can see from that that the average number is about 1.8. So it's not as if these executives have worked with a lot of different firms. They don't bounce around at all. Typically, they might have had 1 or 2 firms and then been in the same firm and promoted within. So the years, you can see also that tenure with the firm, the current firm, between 13 and 18, depending on exactly the average conditioning depending on which variables you condition on. And many of these people have worked as worked as a top executive between 15 and 25. That's the average. So this gives a little bit of a sense of the heterogeneity. One thing that you should note here is that women are slightly younger, you can see, than is that right? Yeah, it's a couple of years younger than males, and that could be partly a reflection of the fact that they're in the lower ranks and leave earlier, and so they're sort of cycling through a little bit more than males. They also have slightly more education, but it's pretty similar demographics aside from that. And you're only seeing marginals there, so that's the sense in which, of course, quite a few of these things are correlated. So here's the structure of the model that we're going to, that we use to estimate, that we estimate with this data. There's a huge amount of variation in compensation. You kind of saw that, glanced, only pushed you through it pretty quickly. But there's a lot of volatility, both at the individual level and also across the rank and firm. And so it's kind of a question as to what happens when you try and unpack different components of compensation. So you need a model to do that, because if we're going to try and predict what's going to happen when we change the regulations, well, then we need to take these kinds of things into account, of course. So there's a value maximizing principle, risk-averse agents, and there's pretty long literature on managerial compensation that goes back to the idea that agents' actions are not contractable. Probably what the agent does is not really observed. Standard moral hazard problem. In a dynamic model, it's not totally clear that just because there are hidden actions that the agent would behave in a different way from what the principal wants, because the agent also cares about promotion opportunities. And so there's literature that dates back on career concerns, and this is, I think, goes back to Farmer, but Jensen and Murphy, Gibbons and Murphy also really followed through on this, that argued that because of these kind of long-term alignments, if you like, then what would be a moral hazard problem in a static framework could be resolved in a dynamic framework. And the framework that we're looking at now seeks to capture that by having these long-term kind of, modeling these long-term kind of issues. And we're going to look at a sequential equilibrium. There are no subgames in this world, because when the worker decides whether they're going to, or the agent decides whether they're going to work or not in any given period, the principal does not know whether whether the agent has worked in the previous periods or not. So the principal doesn't know how much human capital the agent has accumulated in the meantime. And so there is incomplete information in this framework. And that becomes a little bit problematic when we're talking about off-equilibrium behavior, because when you're off the equilibrium path, there's a question about what you actually assume. We're taking the view that you kind of assume the worst, but in other words, if the agent, for example, says, "Hey, I'm sorry, I've been shirking for these last few periods. Please forgive me." It's like, no, you're gone. That's the kind of assumption that we have in this framework as to what goes on in the off-equilibrium path. On the on-equilibrium path, the agent is going to be motivated each period. And so the question will be, what does it take to motivate this person? So a little bit of notation, but you're not really expected to follow it. Kind of notation through the conference, I guess. But you do have consumption separate from wages in this setup. And it's a little bit different from Jeremy's one, because the competitive equilibrium, therefore, is not going to be as easy to derive as it was, where you've essentially got profit maximizing agents. And so you don't have that risk sharing thing that you have to worry about. There's a question as to what kind of job you take. Namely, do you start in a new firm? What kind of rank do you take? There's no matching stuff really going on here. That's something that's more or less missing, in the sense that the production technology is just going to be additive, more or less, across workers. And so doesn't catch that network effect, which is a limitation of this framework, I would say, because I think those kinds of issues are important. And so you're going to choose firm, industrial sector, which kind of position, whether you retire or not, catching the kinds of things that I showed in those bar graphs, and catching the compensation, but not catching the togetherness of people, except in one important respect that I'll get to in a minute. There are a bunch of characteristics that the agent takes along with it, mainly himself, and also the number of years they've worked, as an executive, and that's going to be somewhat important here, because people, the longer they've worked, the longer that there will be this human capital accumulation, or not, if they had not been working, if they hadn't followed the equilibrium path. In this setup, the agent is going to lose all their internal capital unless they remain with the firm and work. Okay, that's another aspect to this, which is a little bit drastic. And then there's a question of, well, to what extent would we be able to identify a model if we had something a little more flexible? And that's something that we really haven't explored properly yet, although I'm a little bit pessimistic as to how far you can go. You more or less have to make an assumption along those lines, or something like it, I think. They add to their human capital by working, and that's something that I think we can relax in terms of how human capital evolves when you're working. And also you can add to your external capital by switching firms. And so that's something that also is allowed here. And really, the reason why those different that H vector exists is because we're seeing stuff in the data that says the number of firms that you've worked with in the past really does count. And the amount of time that you've been with the current firm also counts. So we need those separate components in there as part of a vector. And then we're also seeing that depending on how long people have been with the firm, they maybe need to be more or less motivated. You do not have to motivate PhD students for the most part, because they have a career ahead of them. They're willing to spend thousands of dollars to hear people like us. But when you're talking about the people who already have tenure, perhaps not you, John, but then it's kind of like you've got to motivate them really hard to get them to actually show up and put in effort, because there's no future in front of them anyway. And so that's sort of, well, I shouldn't say that, should I? We talked about death. And so the incentives are really different. And so you're going to need cash or something along those lines to be able to kind of make them move in the direction you want. And that's what this model is more or less getting at. So there's lifetime consumption, and of course they prefer to shirk rather than work. And so the alpha parameters are in there to reflect the fact that if they do what the firm wants them to do, they get less utility than if they do what they would really like to do, if they were paid a constant compensation that was independent of their effort. That would give them utility of a beta. And that explains why the alpha gives them more disutility than the beta. Notice this is an exponential utility function up there. And so we have a negative out the front. And the reason we have exponential utility is that we don't have data on their outside wealth. And so because we don't have data on the outside wealth, if we use something that wasn't exponential, well, then even a short-term contract would need to control for that wealth, and then we'd have to integrate over it because we don't have the data. And so in a sense, using the exponential assumption is a cheap way of being able to avoid that fairly intractable integration problem, which is probably not going to help us much anyway in terms of computation. And so that's the sense in which, like the logit functional form, this exponential utility function is quite useful, particularly if you're looking at people that have kind of comparable wealth. And if you don't have people with comparable wealth and they don't switch around too much, well, then it just might be easier to estimate with different risk aversion parameters. Yeah. So firm technology, as I said before, is more or less additive in terms of the different types of in terms of the different types of executives. But there is one important sense in which they do really combine, and it's the same as the one that I mentioned in class earlier this week, and which is that if they all work together and do what they're supposed to do, you achieve one kind of output. That's the density for F. That's the F density. But if one of them decides to deviate from what would be the equilibrium, what is the equilibrium effort, then that one-shot deviation is going to pull down the density to F times G as the density. In other words, G is the likelihood ratio between the density when one of them shirks versus the density when all of them work. And that G likelihood ratio is subscripted by a JK to reflect the fact that depending on the kind of position that the firm, that the person has, that's going to affect the density in a different way. Remember, the J is the rank and the K as the type of firm. So that's the sense in which there is interaction, but only on that dimension. And the reason, the excuse, as to why we haven't got a more detailed kind of measure of the interaction is that we hardly see anything these executives do. You know, you hear about them playing golf, but you don't actually know exactly how they function together. And in this sense, this is not a very good industry to be able to really grab the network stuff, as opposed to something where technology was just a little more transparent, so you could see some more about what the actual physical or whatever the product was of the group working together. Okay, here's the model structure. Each executive knows at the front end, chooses their consumption. Of course, that could be at the back end. That doesn't matter how you time subscript it. That you privately observe your own epsilon, and that's going to be for different types of positions and different types of firms. In this setup, the executive is just going to move into whatever they like, okay? And whatever they like really means stay with the firm or move to another firm. And also there's going to be a cross with the different types of industry as well, okay? And then you also choose your position. And so I could choose to be a CEO, but then I would take the compensation that was appropriate for me being a CEO. I would definitely be in that 20%. That get negative. And so there is that's how the choices work. And so it's not really capturing how different people get chosen for these different, doesn't capture how people get chosen for these different jobs. They propose, each of them proposes a compensation schedule. The shareholders are rational, and so they see what they're in for and understand the information that the lack of information that they have, and hence what the manager is offering. We have financial compensation committees that do exactly this kind of thing, worry about this for presumably partly for the board, but also for shareholders. If the proposal's off the equilibrium path, shareholders believe the worst, nothing happens. And so it's a kind of an ultimatum game in which shareholders know what managers can get away with and vice versa, and they take what they can. And then they move ahead, they privately choose what kind of effort they're going to put in, the human capital is updated, the optimal contracts one in which everybody works, and we can see that in the data because they get this variation, otherwise it would have been constant. And then people update the beliefs. The board thinks that the board or the shareholders think that the executives are going to work hard. The shareholders do the agent does whatever is optimal for him, which may be work hard, maybe not. In equilibrium, it's work hard. And then it goes from there. So when you work that through, you basically end up with a dynamic optimization problem. If you look at equation 1 there, it looks very much like your standard Bellman equation. It sort of is. What you're making a choice about what you're going to do. That's the epsilon and the set of epsilon, one of the epsilons you'll pick, and then the V is essentially like a conditional value function. And that min below is just a reflection of whether you're going to shirk or work. And what we've done there is exploited a couple of properties of a particular parameterization of this model. First of all, we're assuming that it's type 1 extreme value in this slide. And so that's why the future can be captured by what's the probability that the guy is going to retire next period. In other words, there's a terminal state there, a terminal action in there, and that probability is capturing the human capital aspect, because the more likely he is likely to retire, the less likely he is to want to accumulate human capital, the less valuable it is as an investment thing for him. And as a result of that, you better compensate him so he works hard, otherwise it's not going to happen. And then the alpha and the beta are there, obviously, to reflect the fact that if he works hard, well, you go the alpha route. And if he works soft, you go the beta route. And notice in that setup, the H's are going to be updated differently, because everyone else is thinking you're working hard when in fact you're shirking. So that's the nature of the theorem. And that allows us to apply the kinds of tools that I talked about with CCP estimation to a problem like this one. So in equilibrium, I said that the executives propose contracts that incentivize themselves, otherwise they're not going to be accepted. And we have an incentive compatibility constraint that reflects the fact that not only those little V primes on the right hand side are just a transformation of the compensation. So think of the stuff right over on that right hand side as being compensation. The V times the G is a reflection of the fact that if you don't work, if you shirk, well, you're not going to integrate the future output according to you working, but according to you shirking, the expectation is taken with respect to a density F. And so that's taking care of the compensation side. And then also, just immediately to the right of the inequality, you've got these probabilities that are reflecting these investment these different probabilities of retirement. And so you could rewrite that. So you took the denominator on the right-hand side and plunked it up there with the alpha that is less than or equal to the beta times the stuff on the top over on that right-hand side. And you would get that trade-off that the executive faces between going one way shirking and then what happens versus going the other way working and then what happens. And so the incentive compatibility constraint is going to make sure that inequality is satisfied so that it's optimal for them to work. It's pretty easy to see that that in fact that in some special cases you don't need to incentivize the executive, because suppose you're paid him a constant compensation, the same compensation, and then you looked at and you made that independent of the output. Well, then the terms on the right-hand side are completely cancel out, okay? Because you're paying him the same compensation, flat compensation, regardless of of his actions. And then we would say, well, it better be the case that the alpha on the beta, in other words, the disutility he gets from working, is not strong enough to offset the fact that he has a future in the firm, maybe. In particular, providing the probability term on the ratio of the probabilities of retiring big enough, that ratio is big enough, well then he'll work anyway. And that's the PhD case, where you don't have to incentivize these people. You can pay them a flat stipend, don't have to make it dependent on grades. This is not a policy recommendation, because they will work. In this situation, they'll work anyway. In other words, providing the probability is low enough, they have enough of a future in the firm, then you don't have to incentivize them. This is going back to the farmer and Gibbons-Murphy kind of case, and it's coming straight out of this kind of model. Good, thanks. So you've got the compensation. You go through the optimal contract, because having worked through the individual having worked through the individual optimization problem for the agent, you then come back to the principal and say, how do you set the compensation to minimize the cost, given the expected cost of employing these guys for to achieve enough of these people joining onto the firm. In equilibrium, a fraction of them are not going to join anyway. So you don't have what is usually called a participation constraint, because some of them are going to go away anyway because they get epsilons that tell them to go somewhere else. And so in equilibrium, what you want to match is the participation probability that what you actually see in equilibrium. And so there are basically, and so you're minimizing subject to that participation probability, the incentive probability, taking the incentive compatibility constraint, and taking account of both the investment value and also the disutility aspect. You get a compensation that looks like the one you can see in equation 5 there, with all those different pieces in it. I think I'll just move on. Those pieces have come straight from the primitives themselves. I'm not going to go through the details, of course, but they just weren't made up. And then you have a free entry condition to reflect the idea that the firm will only hire somebody if they're getting their expected value out of them. So that's the setup we've got. These agents are looking at different kinds of lotteries, because different positions come in different types of risk averse, different types of uncertainty. Some jobs don't have as much uncertainty as others. As a result, we can estimate the attitudes to risk from the choices that they make. Should point out now that we do not find that women are more risk averse than males. So that, just in case I don't get into that, I think I will move on now to briefly describe the estimation, or actually I won't even do that because I can see I'm running out of time. What I want to do is talk about the results. On the estimation side, perhaps I should have said there's going to be, no, I won't. Won't get that. Let's have a look at the estimates that you get out of this framework. The first thing is that if you have a large number of insiders on the board, that tends to reduce their expected pay and also reduces their certainty equivalent pay. In other words, these entrenched guys have their way. Shareholders react by saying, okay, you got your way, but we're not going to pay you as much, okay? Let's move on to the interlocked guys. Those people who are interlocked, again, get less expected pay and also a lower certainty equivalent. Difference is mainly due to more agreeable work routines. And here we're looking at their alphas. I should say that the sources of the agency are a little bit lower, but just to point out that if these guys deviate from the optimal action, the firm loses about 20% of their value. So it is really worth motivating these guys. And I think with executive directors, similar kind of thing. They more agreeable work routine, and they get slightly less. And turning finally to females, they receive once you control for these different variables, they actually receive the same expected repay. They earn slightly more in certainty equivalent pay, and they're paid a lower risk premium. In other words, slightly less jobs with less uncertainty associated with them, not due to the risk aversion factor, because we find that they're about the same. They have less agreeable work routines, and also lower investment value. And again, that's being driven by the fact that they're not sticking around as long. Shirking is less valuable to them. Now, that could be due to a lot of factors, one of them being that they're going to be really noticed in the firm, and so they just don't have as much. And I think they should stop there.
Okay, thank you very much.